Kick it off. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming out on this beautiful day. I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. If you have not already, please silence your cell phones. We are here today in the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium, and this Saturday and Sunday will be the 30th annual Natchez Powwow at the Grand Village of the Natchez Indians. If you've not been down there to that, it's a great event. It is the only powwow held at a mound site in the United States. There's American Indian music and dance. There is traditional native foods and art that's available for purchase. And it is, I think, $5 general admission, a couple of dollars, $3 for kids. Well worth a trip to Natchez if you have not been to the powwow and if you're interested in Native culture. And I hope that you'll be able to join us here next week when Tom Watts will be our speaker. He will present a Mississippi town called Terry, 1867 to 2017. Terry just celebrated its sesquicentennial anniversary, and they had commissioned Tom to produce a book on the history of the town. I have seen that. It's really great. It should be a great program. Today we are delighted to have with us Malcolm White and Ginger Williams Cook to present The Artful Evolution of Hal and Mal's, I love this quote, the most talked about upscale honky-tonk in all of Mississippi. You got to aspire to something. Malcolm White is a public servant and entrepreneur who has worked in the fields of food, music, art, and culture for more than 40 years. With their extended family, he and his late brother Hal created and lovingly nurtured the evolution of one of Mississippi's most renowned public gathering places. Ginger Williams Cook is an artist, mother, and arts educator here in Jackson. Her illustrations have appeared on national publications and products. Help me welcome Malcolm White and Ginger Williams Cook.
Thanks, Chris. All right. Well, thanks a lot for having us, and we would like to officially welcome all of you to my neighborhood. I have lived, worked, and played on LaFleur's Bluff since 1983, so it's nice to have neighbors, including this remarkable facility, this cultural institution we call two museums. What a tremendous addition to the neighborhood. And so we're really happy to have the museums here, to have them open, to have accomplished this magnificent feat that I think is one of the more remarkable things that the state of Mississippi has ever achieved. Culturally, I always brag that the Blues Trail is probably the most significant cultural achievement, the Blues Trail, the Freedom Trail, and the Country Trail during my public service tenure, but this museum certainly topped that in terms of a significant achievement for the state of Mississippi. So welcome to LaFleur's Bluff, welcome to my neighborhood, and welcome to your museums. My goal in life is to begin with gratitude and to end in grace. So with that in mind, I would like to thank all the people who made this project possible, particularly Ginger Williams Cook, who bought into this idea a long time ago. She actually has a memory history of our timeline, which I was fascinated to see, and I think she's going to share with you later, because I don't have the memory that she has. Someone told me the other day, he said, "Man, I really enjoyed your book. You have a great memory." And I said, "Really?" It was always my brother, quite frankly, who had the great memory in our group, and I often still think I need to ask Hal about that, and of course he's gone. So think about the people in your lives who are your history and who represent history and can recall and treasure them. I remember hearing Joan Baez one time. I heard an interview where Joan Baez said that she used to be highly annoyed of the general public who used to pester her constantly for autographs and to talk to her and to tell her how much they loved her work. And she said it was just a constant annoyance, just people constantly pulling on her and asking her questions and asking for autograph and talking to her and interviewing her and stuff. Until one day she got old enough to to understand that she was history and that she had an obligation to this story that she represented, and that people had a right to her as living history. And so she stopped being that way about it and started recognizing that that was her job. So we have this project that we are delighted to share with you today, and the University Press of Mississippi certainly is our partner and has done a magnificent job of putting this book together and rolling it out. And I don't know how much you know about the University Press of Mississippi, but I would encourage you to learn more, to know more about them. They are an amazing and highly accomplished publisher, and they do fantastic work. And Ginger and I would not be here today if it were not for the great, steady work of the University Press. Y'all come on in and sit down. You don't have to stand back there unless you just like standing. So I typically say to people, I'm not going to read to you because you can all read, and if I read to you, then you might not buy the book. But I am going to read a little bit just to kind of set the stage for what we're doing here today. So first, I'll read a touch from the introduction, which sort of sets the stage for this idea, this project. And then the way we're going to roll this out is I'm going to stand and talk to you for 20 minutes or so, and then Ginger's going to come and make her presentation. She has a beautiful PowerPoint. I have nothing but my voice and the book cover, which Ginger shared with me. And then at the end, we will stay and answer questions, and I understand that you guys are pretty particular about your format. So Chris has schooled us on time, so he's to signal us. So if you see a tall gentleman who's a part-time drummer and a full-time public servant doing this, it means that we need to get on track and move right along. Okay, to the book. This eclectic art project, cleverly disguised as a book about a bar and a restaurant, is a collaboration between artist Ginger William Cook's illustrations and my reflections of the people, the place, and the history of Hal and Mal's, an iconic eating, drinking, and gathering place, some say an institution, in downtown Jackson, Mississippi. Although 59% of hospitality businesses fail within 3 years of their founding, Hal and Mal's has remained in operation for more than 3 decades and counting. Longevity notwithstanding, the major tenets of our business philosophy has always been: 1, embrace art, culture, and creativity as a strategy, not as an afterthought. 2, the more we give, the more successful we are. Thus, as we evolve, we become successful, and as we became successful, we became more artful and more important to the community that we chose to serve. I have borrowed the concept of this book from 2 of my best friends and collaborators, Robert St. John and Wyatt Waters. I can only dream that this project will have as much success as the volumes of art that the 2 of them have created. Hal and Mal's was originally operated by brother Hal and me, as well as my wife, Vivian Piggott Neal, though she and I later divorced. Later in the journey, Ann White worked alongside of Hal, and then we were joined by Hal and Ann's daughter, Brandy, her then husband, PJ, my daughter with Vivian, Zeta Mallory, Zeta's husband, Webb, and Hal and Ann's son, Taylor. Until her passing at the age of 96, Zeta Radakovitz Piggott worked the front counter from day one. There's also a family tree in the front of the book, which was a real struggle, but Ginger painted a beautiful live oak tree that's, and I attempted to put the names of the characters that you meet in the book They're both listed in the index and in the family tree. So if you are reading the book and you get confused, I hope that that will be helpful. My dear old friend, newsman Bert Case, used to joke with me about the first time I told him that I was going to open Hal and Mal's. I served and socialized with Bert for many, many years at George Street Grocery, the epicenter of downtown Jackson politics and media in the 1970s and 1980s. I ran into Bert sometime after I'd completed my tenure as manager of this venerable watering hole, and he asked about my future plans. I explained that my brother and I were going to open a bar, restaurant, and live music venue in the old GM&O Freight Depot on Commerce Street, just down the block from WLBT, where Bert held nightly court during the 5 o'clock and 10 o'clock evening broadcast alongside Woody Asaph, Marsh Thompson, Dennis Carl Smith, and my best friend from Boonville, the irrepressible Michael Rubenstein. Bert Case listened politely. Then he shook his head with a smirk and slowly said, "Malcolm, you're going to lose your ass." Many years later, as we relived that conversation and his miscalculation of my risky little enterprise, he would add, "Malcolm, when you told me about Hal and Mal's, I thought you guys were nuts and that you would need to be institutionalized. Now, you and your brother and your business have become an institution. Man, was I wrong about that one." Sadly, we lost Bert and the voice and the beloved Bert Case in 2016. But his influence and legacy lives on in local lore. Our dream of Hal and Mal's was rooted in an active culinary childhood along the Mississippi Gulf Coast, reinforced by years of living and working in New Orleans, and ultimately launched in Jackson in 1985. This gathering place has always been owned and operated by family, now in the second and third generations. The multifunctional, southern-soaked rooms are adorned with memorabilia and chock full of local character. Each one also features a stage for live music. The kitchen serves a steady offering of hearty regional samples with a nod toward the Gulf of Mexico. My good buddy Bill Ellison always says, Hal and Mal's is the most talked about upscale honky-tonk in all of Mississippi. It's a place where art is made, music is played, and folks gather to share community, to celebrate the best of Mississippi's creative spirit. Until as recently as the 1960s, Mississippians traditionally entertained at home with their friends and family rather than in restaurants, cafes, or other public eating facilities. Perhaps partly because of isolation, poverty, and the resulting lack of sophistication and or education, Jackson had little dining out culture beyond the historically significant Greek-owned eateries sprinkled around downtown, particularly along the major thoroughfares of Capitol Street and Highway 80, the Rotisserie, the Mayflower Cafe, Dinneries, the People's Cafe, Fisherman's Wharf, Bill's Burger House, Primo's, Crochel's, Paul's, and the E-Light kept us sustained and entertained until other places of public dining began to arrive in the 1970s. Hal and Mal's may not belong in the same rarefied league as these formidable places, but when we opened, their success, their history, and their sense of place strongly influenced our ambitious plans. The millions who have come and gone through our doors have included both famous and not so famous. John Grisham, a relatively unknown state legislator, when he first hosted his book, asked us to host the signing in 1988 because, frankly, no one else would. We agreed, and the rest is history. This book project offers another way that you can join us. It provides a glimpse into our family history, our live music performances, our good solid grub, and our very own Southern-style cafe society, viewed through the graphic novel lens envisioned by Ginger. This book is not meant to be a vertical history or chronological history of our family. Rather, it is a collection of words and art that attempts to capture our sense of home and community, the manner in which we gather for food, drink, and fellowship, and most importantly, the people who we gathered with. In some cases, my written vignettes are a response to Ginger's art. In others, her art pieces illustrate one of my short stories. But we are always dancing and playing off one another, just like we do at Hal and Mal's. So that is a synopsis of the intro. And as I said earlier, Ginger will share with you a bit more of the actual timeline because she has the better memory of the two. Now, I thought I would read just a touch from the vignette about the G&O Freight Depot since we are in a historical setting, and I figured most of you are sort of interested in history, so I thought I would share a bit from that. And I did a little bit of this research over next door in the Winter Building in order to try to get close to the history here. So this is from the GM&O. And if you don't know it, the book is based on short stories that I call vignettes. A vignette is a short piece between 800 and 1,200 words, and each vignette is matched with an art, with a painting. So in the beginning, we were told by University Press they wanted 40 stories and 40 paintings. We ended up with about 55, 56 paintings, and I don't know how many stories, probably close to 40, but that was the concept. The concept was vignettes, paintings, and this vignette's title is GM&O. Just for the record, the building that houses Hal and Mal's is currently owned by the state of Mississippi. We have leased it for more than 35 years, and I figure that we have paid the state about $1 million in rent so far and spent well over $500,000 more in making the place inhabitable. In the late 1970s, a group of investors had signed a 15-year lease and planned a major multi-purpose redevelopment of the space. They were unable to raise the money that they needed and happily signed the lease over to us in late 1982. The original lease document had been signed by Governor Cliff Finch. He was governor from 76 to 1980. The structure was built in 1927, and it served as the freight depot for the Gulf, Mobile, and Northern Railroad. Just north of us is another old building that was also constructed in 1927 to serve as the passenger depot for the GM&O and the New Orleans Great Northern Railroad. Those two lines merged during the 1930s, and in the 1940s, the GM&O and the Mobile and Ohio combined to become the Gulf, Mobile, and Ohio Railroad. Until 1954, when passenger service ended, the other building, known as the GM&O Depot, served as the railway's passenger depot. The state of Mississippi purchased that building in 1982, and it is now occupied by the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Did I get that right, Dr. Hilliard? Part of it. Mississippi and alcohol have long had an odd relationship. The state had no minimum legal drinking age prior to 1920, when the 18th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution ushered in the Prohibition era. Prohibition was repealed 13 years later, and the drinking age was set at 18. But Mississippi continued to ban alcohol. Nevertheless, in 1944, the state instituted a 10% tax on alcohol sales, creating a paradoxical situation in which the state was taxing something that was illegal. Not until 1966 did the Mississippi legislature end the statewide ban on alcohol sales and allow counties to determine their own policies. In 1986, U.S. law required all states to raise the drinking age to 21 or lose federal highway funds. And all states complied, except Louisiana. It took them a while. With legislation pending, we saw the handwriting on the wall, and in late 1985, we began posting music acts and specialty events that appealed to an older audience. Albert King, the Blue Beats, the Blues Boys, Lazy Day, Mitch Ryder without the Detroit Wheels, Marcia Ball, and Mitch Wood and his Rocket 88s were some of the bands that we transitioned from the old Lamar, which we had rented a space to in the early 80s, to what later became Hal and Mal's. We also hosted a number of special events. Among them was the Black Tie Christmas and the 1985 Mal's St. Patty's Parade and a few Millsaps frat parties. Ironically, the National Minimum Drinking Age Act had given birth to Hal and Mal's. All right. Now I'm going to read a little bit, share a little bit from a vignette called Aunt Murtis's Gumbo. And if you've ever eaten at Hal and Mal's and you've ever ordered the gumbo, you have eaten Aunt Murtis's Gumbo. In 1989, Sissy Anderson, the widow of Walter Anderson, had published a great book called Approaching the Magic Hour. And I was fortunate enough to have met her a few years before by visiting the Shearwater property and going to the gift shop a lot. And she used to spend quite a bit of time down there. So I had known her. We were somewhat friends. We were friends with the family. And so that is why she ends up in this story. My mother, Nelda Jean, had two older sisters, Von Seal and Murtis. All of the Stewart sisters were raised in a big old house in Wiggins that their father had helped to craft. An outbuilding behind the house had been added to house Papa Bush, my grandmother's father, in his elder years. And after Papa Bush passed, Grandfather Stewart used the structure as a wood shop filled with his ancient tools and an overhead handicrafted village for his beloved purple martins, who wintered in South America but returned each spring. North Americans were completely taken by the purple martins, and they used to hollow out these gourds to suspend for their dwellings. The early European dwellers adopted this custom of the gourd dwellings, and my grandfather followed suit. His Purple Martin community featured a church, a school, a post office, and various houses and shops. Among them was a tiny cafe inn that I always like to think of as Hal and Mal's. In the early 1940s, when John James Audubon was trekking across the continent making his historic bird paintings, he recorded in one of his journals, almost every country tavern has a martin box on the upper part of the signboard. And I have observed that the handsomer the box, the better does the inn generally prove to be. We always eagerly awaited the spectacle of these winged visitors to Papa Stewart's yard. He taught us that the faithful martins were the only bird species that totally depended on human-supplied nest boxes, and that they actually preferred to nest in close proximity to us. In return for the accommodations, they provide us with endless hours of song and grace, of aerial acrobatics, and as my grandmother liked to point out, they feasted on a vast quantity of insects, especially the dreaded scourge of summer, the ubiquitous and insidious mosquito. The Stewart girls did not ramble far from their roots in life or in death. They grew up in the Piney Hills area of Wiggins and in the sandy soiled hamlet of Perkinston, just 5 miles south, barely beyond Red Creek. And all three of them are buried on a hillside in Woodlawn Park Cemetery, just east of Wiggins. The middle sister, Murtis, was a ball of energy, a doer. She cooked, sewed, taught Sunday school, and served as the Cub Scout den mother. In summer months, she delighted us by making popsicles from Kool-Aid and from fruit juice. In addition to being a gracious and loving aunt, Murtis Stewart Cron was a devoted wife and mother. Her husband, L.A. Cron, used to ask her to refill the empty drinking glasses by saying, "Sweeten her up, Murtis." And to this day, we pay homage to that remarkable lady around my house by using the phrase of "sweeten her up, Murtis," when you need a refill. L.A. was the business manager at the Perkinston Junior College and always was involved in some sort of project. He never had any trouble really recruiting myself and my cousins, Larry, Janine, and Terry David, known as Tiger, as well as Hal and I, to participate. Clearing land, building weekend cabins, digging lakes, organizing this or that adventure. The best one was the houseboat in the camp on Mary Walker Bayou, the brackish waterway connecting the magnificent Chutica Bluff River that flows 30 miles south to the wide mouth just north of Biloxi Bay. Noted Mississippi potter George Orr mostly dug his clay from this incredible otherworldly place to create his masterpieces right from the banks of the Chutica Bluff, which takes its name from the Biloxi Indian word for broken pot. We also love the local lore regarding how the bayou got its name. Mary Walker was supposedly a lady from New Orleans who came to live in the fishing and logging camps along the waterway, but was subsequently extracted and intrigued to come back to Louisiana on account of her alleged misdoings. In addition to the old boathouse, which was rigged with a full kitchen for long weekends out on the river, Uncle L.A. and Aunt Murtis, the compound, featured a waterfront pier with john boats and ski boats. As the weekend and holiday paradise, my cousins, my brothers, and I were drawn to the big oak, a massive live oak tree perched on the banks of the river where we would tie up our watercraft, set up our day camps, and spend summer days skiing, fishing, swimming, and lazing around. Our friends, the Cooks and the Davises, also kept the camp at Mary Walker. Billy and Mary Cook were like family to us. We spent enormous amounts of time with them and their children and accompanied them on many memorable summer sojourns to the Great Smoky Mountains and the emerald beaches of Northwest Florida. Mary Walker is also where Hal and I first tasted Aunt Murtis's gumbo, which I now think of as fish camp gumbo, meaning that it is you use whatever has been caught that day. And what we serve today at Hal and Mal's is more or less a version of that. Aunt Murtis caught and picked blue crabs, bought or netted local shrimp, made a magnificent dark roux of pork fat and flour, then slowly added sausage, ham, okra, tomatoes, onions, peppers, a bay leaf or two, and a handful of herbs and spices. Hal and I always got tickled when customers will come in and call us to the table and complain by saying, "There's a leaf in my gumbo." And we say, "Yes, that is a bay leaf. It is used for seasoning, and it is good luck for the patron who ends up with it. Just like the king cake at Mardi Gras, the recipient gets to host the next party." On our first Hal and Mal's menu, I wrote that Aunt Murtis's gumbo recipe was created and learned at the Mary Walker Bayou, near the hamlet of Van Cleve. One day, Sissy Anderson, the widow of the well-known Ocean Springs potter Walter Anderson, lunched at the restaurant and summons me to the table to set the record straight. "Mary Walker Bayou," she said, "is nearest to Gaucher," which happens to be Miss Sissy's childhood home. I and the menu have forever stood corrected. All right. How are we doing on time? Okay, well, that's a good stopping point. Oh, no, wait, I have one little thing I want to share with you before I get out of here. Promise I'll be brief. This is from the last vignette, which is a total dedication to my brother Hal. And in fact, the whole book, from my perspective, is a love story to my brother and to our childhood and to our family and to this community, which we came to accept and to treat as our second family, this community of Jackson, which I dearly love, and so did Hal. And we were committed to it and to downtown. And for those who wonder why we're so crazy to still be downtown, it's because it was a commitment that we made a very long time ago. Anyway, we grew up Hal and Mal, no space, inseparable, the boys. Our mother died when we were small, and we were raised by our community, our family, and primarily by our grandparents until our stepmother came along. And then Brother Brad arrived to expand the family brothers from a duo to a trio. By the time we got to high school, Hal and I had started to move, at least slightly, in different directions. In the Boy Scouts, Hal was a Royal Order of the Arrow. I never made second class. He was a quarterback. I was blocking fullback. He was elected most handsome, and I was most carefree. He paged for U.S. Representative Jamie Whitten, while my summers I spent working for U.S. Senator John Stennis. By the late 1960s, he tended toward fast cars, Raquel Welch, and the Beach Boys, while I tilted toward Frank Zappa, Janis Joplin, and our old Willis Jeep. We grew up Southern Baptist. Hal converted to Catholicism. He loved Mississippi State, where he and I briefly shared a dorm room, though I rarely ever slept there. Dad and I graduated from University of Southern Mississippi, and Brad got his degree from Ole Miss. Hal joined the National Guard, while I was graced with a triple-digit lottery number. While he was off to basic training, I was just off. But our lives were always remained interwoven. We shared clothes, apartments, houses, cars, friends, dropped in and out of college, dated a few of the same women, and never lived more than a few miles apart until I departed for California in 1973. He once got me a job working on a construction crew, and I hired him to run the dining room at the Bourbon Orleans Hotel in New Orleans, where we worked together and lived on Royal Street for several years. For a while in Hattiesburg, we were arch competitors. He ran the Holiday Inn, while I managed the Ramada Inn. Sometimes in the 1970s, we decided we would someday open our very own restaurant and use family recipes, book live bands, and cover the wall with Mississippi art and culture. A decade later, we did. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ginger Williams Cook.
Hi, thank you all for being here. I just want to give a little brief introduction, just that I am an artist and a Jackson native. I have an art studio in the Fondren area, and I went to school at William Carey College in Gulfport and have a BFA in painting and drawing. So illustration's always been a passion of mine, and sketching real life as it happens has always been something that I've loved, but I've always thought, how can I make a living doing this, just sketching as I go along? And so this project started with this little sketchbook. So I'd love to give you a little history about how it started. This is the drawing that really started the beginning of the project. Hal and Mal's was having a big birthday celebration, and my husband Justin was in a band, and they were going to play that night. So I knew I'd be there for a while, so I brought a bag of markers and this sketchbook, and I wanted to try to catch every different stage in the restaurant. So this was the main bar. And when I was drawing this, Malcolm walked up and spoke to me and talked to me about the drawing. And he said, well, you know, those light fixtures used to be in a restaurant on Highway 80 called the Green Derby. And I grew up going to that restaurant. And so as he kept kind of going along through little details about the architecture and things that were chosen on the walls, there were so many stories, and the stories just kept going. So there's my husband on the end, the bass player at the time. And this is in the red room. This is the bar. So, I mean, the whole place was just full of music that night. So this was about 2010. Here's the oyster bar. And this is another illustration. Malcolm came back around after I'd drawn, and he was like, well, you know, Connie, who is, you know, in this band right now, her photo was on a bowling trophy, and then started talking about Willie Morris. And so these stories just kept coming. And so he, you know, Malcolm said, I'd love to do a book one day. And I was immediately on board. I was like, you let me know anytime. So it was such a fun night and a fun experience to just draw the people, because the people are who help give that richness and that sense of home that Hal and Mal's has. So shortly after Hal passed, this was 2013, I saw Malcolm again, and with you know, laser focus, he said, we've got to get this book done. We're going to make this book happen. So we met, we had a couple of meetings, and the pitch that we had prepared wound up being sort of the outline for the entire book, of just little vignettes, not chronological, but just a fully illustrated book that could be like a coffee table book, or picking up an artist's sketchbook and having a fully illustrated book, no photographs, because there's a different engagement that the viewer has when you're looking at watercolors, you know, versus some photographs. So if you're familiar with the man on the bar stool right there, that's Richard Kelso. So there's a story about Richard Kelso. He's an artist, the artist upstairs. So I thought that was really funny when I went in to do a sketch for our pitch, that Richard Kelso was drawing me, drawing him, and drawing the book. So it was this very like fun little connection to why Hal and Mal's is the way it is. So this is just a close-up of that pitch sketch that I did. And this was another connection with the pitch. I loved when Malcolm talked about Hal's recipe cards, because it was in this giant binder and had splatters from soups and just, you know, stained and like almost this different texture from the humidity in the kitchen. It just had such a richness that I felt like if I combined an illustration of Hal with his recipe card, even for a pitch to University Press, it was like, this is going to be good, because it was just really authentic and very genuine. And so After we had a meeting with University Press, they were so gracious and generous, and they were ready to make it happen. So from there, Malcolm started working on the stories. The main thing that we needed to do was come up with an outline. And so for me, the process was a lot of fun, and it was very checklist oriented. I knew that I had to do paintings of photographs of Malcolm and Hal when they were boys, and of Bud Spires, and there's an empty wine glass there. So, it was a lot of fun to do paintings from stories that I've heard and read about these images that mean so much to their family, and. This was one of my favorite paintings, and the backstory of them getting a logo, and even thinking about before Photoshop, well, we need good profiles, so let's take dueling Polaroids of each other and just cut it out. And so this is taped up on the office, inside the office, and there are just so many wonderfully rich details like this throughout the restaurant. So this is just an image of my workspace when I wasn't in the restaurant, and I would set up the image on my computer to the right. I'd have palettes, my watercolor pencils and my Prismacolor pencils, and here you can't really see it, but it's a highlighted checklist. So to be a creative, to have somebody give you a checklist for a project is just one of the greatest things, So I would just highlight when I would get the illustration done and just go from there. And so it was a lot of fun. And so I went, I took a block of time to do a food illustration series, because as an artist, when I was working with watercolor and gouache, and I would have to build a palette ahead of time. And watercolor and gouache, you can always activate with water. So I wanted all of the paintings to have the same color scheme throughout. So that's how I would work in blocks. So I braced myself for the food week, and I let the restaurant know ahead of time. And so they would prepare all the dishes that I needed to illustrate. And so I got a lot of side eyes from people at the lunch crowd, because I was taking pictures and drawing, and they're like, that's a lot of food. So, I don't think I'd ever really illustrated food before up until this point. So the Hal and Mal's plates were so colorful and fun to paint, and I wanted to include the new menu, and so it was a really enjoyable process. This is probably one of my favorite paintings, because I started out with sort of a ghost sketch, and it's just a light pencil sketch of the scene. That was the original pitch, because it's my favorite angle in the restaurant. And I like to say that in certain areas, before I added any details, I would create big pools of color, like an area of green, or because you don't know if it's really day or night when you're in Hal and Mal's, and you can see the neon light shining on the rafters and shining on the wall and underneath, and so it's a really beautiful blending of colors. And it made me think, I was like, well, Hal and Mal's just has a really nice patina on everything, and it has this beautiful light pale green. And so this was just so much fun to paint, and I love the holes in the walls. And Malcolm told me after I'd done it that he said, "Well, that used to be a banana ripening room," and of course, because I was like, "This is just great," all of these little details about the restaurant. The one thing I wanted to capture was the lunch counter, because there are a lot of very dedicated patrons that go to Hal and Mal's and are just part of the lunch crowd, and seeing people around the bar having lunch and knowing if they're going to have lunch by themselves, they're going to sit up to the bar and make a new friend or see an old friend. So it was really important for me to go during the lunch crowd and get capture that. I don't know if you know Maggie, but there's Maggie Stevenson right there. This angle is great too because of I grew up going to Hal and Mal's as a restaurant, you know, and going to the parade. But when I was in high school and I was too young to go get in to see bands play, I could come here to Hal and Mal's and eat food and still see live music played in this room. So, you know, I loved hearing so many little details about from the bowling trophies to everything that Malcolm said. And then I also had this very personal history in this space as well. And so my main goal for illustration was to make you feel like you're there. And I'm really glad that I was able to hand my illustrations off to the university press and trust the layout and the creative people there at the press to do the book layout, because for me, I don't even know that if I had the task of laying out the book or deciding where the pictures would go or where the illustrations what would be the cover illustration. And so I think it was best that they made those decisions. But my favorite detail about this book is that they let the watercolor edges show on all of the illustrations. And to me, that's sort of an unplanned, Bob Ross would call it a happy accident. So those rich details really do come across. And this has just been a great project to work with Malcolm. And I'm just really proud of how everything turned out. So thank you so much for coming today. Did you want to go up and do a Q&A?
Time for questions, if
Okay.
anyone has any. That question over here.
I would like to say before this question that Hubert Worley here took about half of the photographs that hang in Hal and Mal's that Ginger later painted. So this has been a really long journey. Hubert and I have been hanging out, and he's been chronicling my adventures for a long, long time. So anyway, he got the first generation, Ginger got the second.
Hi. Ginger, are any of your prints available, or any of your illustrations available as prints or posters suitable for framing?
They will be right now, and in fact, I brought the originals because Malcolm gets first pick about what illustrations that he wants to have, and we really needed to get a good feel about the calendar of promotions about what we were doing and wanting to really spread out some of the events. So I do plan to have an art exhibit in Jackson, and I'm hoping it's going to be by the beginning of the summer, and then prints will be available. Thank you.
Yes.
You have enough material here and enough great history for a Broadway show, and she certainly knows how to design, and so do you. Have you ever considered making theater out of this? It just made me want to hear more and more and more.
There are enough characters, but you planning on writing a screenplay?
You mean this isn't theater?
I wondered what made you think of doing the Patty's Irish Parade here?
Well,
That's a big project.
Thank you. Yes, I've told that story about 400 times last week. I'll give you the cliff notes here. I had worked at George Street in the early 80s. I was the manager of the place. I had started hosting St. Patrick's parties, and they were a huge success. Prior to that, I had lived in New Orleans, where they have a parade and a party for everything. So I came from the Mississippi Gulf Coast, and I grew up in a culture that celebrates occasions. So I asked the guy that I was working with, Joey Mitchell, about could I have these St. Patrick's parties, and he said yes, and they were very successful. So when I broke off from Joey, and I was trying to make a business of my own called Malcolm White and I was basically starving to death, I came up with this idea about First, I thought it would be a pub crawl. And I decided we would go from one bar to the next, to the next, to the next. However, there were only 4 bars in Jackson. Poets, CS's, George Street, and a fourth one I can't remember the name of. So there wasn't enough crawling to be done. So I thought, well, I'll just go ask Pat at CS's if we can have something that starts there and ends at George Street, and that'll be enough. And the more I talked about it to people like Jill Connor Brown, I said, hey, Jill, I'm going to have a parade. She said, great, I'll be a sweet potato queen. I was like, okay, sounds good. It just sort of grew and grew and grew, and the next thing I know, in the book, you will read a story about, I sat at the bar one day at George Street and talked to a columnist, Rod Cawthon, who worked for the Clarion Ledger, and I was telling him about this idea. And without me knowing it, the next day he wrote a column announcing that I was hosting a parade. So I quickly organized a parade that started at CS's and went down to Capitol Street and made its way back to George Street on a Thursday at 4:30 during rush hour, and I got a permit, and I caused a lot of ruckus. And people were very upset about this traffic jam that I had created. And I turned it into publicity and began to plan for year 2. So it's because I was looking for events. I love St. Patrick's Day. You know, my people are Scots. In New Orleans, there were parades, St. Patty's parades, St. Joseph's parades, Mardi Gras parades, on and on and on. So it was just a notion that I had. I had no idea it would become so popular, of course. Who would know? I started a lot of events that none of you know the names of. Christmas by the River. Who remembers that one, besides Hubert? Who remembers the celebration down on the river with Willie Morris reading and Margaret Walker Alexander reading and Orly Hood as the MC. So I would start these things, and some of them would take off and some of them wouldn't. Wells Fest, another big idea I had, gigantic success. People say, oh, Malcolm, you're so smart. You know, you started Wells Fest. Look how successful. Look at the parade. And I said, yeah, but you should see all the failures. You know, there were many. So I was a promoter, I was a producer, I was an entrepreneur, and I was always coming up with ideas and notions, and some of them worked and some of them didn't. That's the short story. Thanks for asking. Hubert.
What's the source for chicken ziti?
What is the source for it? The recipe for chicken ziti is named for Zita Rudakovitz Piggott, who was the matriarch of Hal and Mal's. She was our moral compass. She worked there from the day we opened until she passed at 96. And the dish was named for her. And in fact, the book is dedicated to my brother and to Zita, who was alive when I dedicated it to her. That's how long it took to get the book out. But she was my mother-in-law, and she came in a boat when she was 8 years old from Austria. It's in the book. It's all in the book. It's under a short story called Four Generations of Strong Women, and it tells Zita's story of how she came here. And she worked at the Hilton for a while before that with Tig Notaro's mother. Tig Notaro's mother ran the gift shop, and Zita was the hostess of the restaurant at the old Hilton on State Street, where Bobby G was the chef. I'm just going back for you people. I know some of you have been around long enough to remember this. But look, we have a great history, and we've encapsulated a tiny, tiny bit of it. Anyway, that's that. Thank you, Hubert. Yes?
Just a personal comment about Hal and Mal. Most of my extended family are from Mississippi and still are, and they're mostly from rural areas, Baptist churches, where every wedding reception is conducted in the reception hall with different names of the Baptist church. And my son and daughter-in-law chose a different path. And when they got married, they had a very small wedding in St. Andrews, and the reception, to which they had invited hundreds of people, was at Hal and Mal's.
Yeah.
And my relatives are still talking about it.
It's the most talked about upscale honky-tonk in all of Mississippi, according to Bill Ellison. Thanks for sharing that. That's really great. I talk to people all the time who met in Hal and Mal's, had their first date, who conceived their child after an evening at Hal and Mal's, and they named their children, for that. And people who grew up in Jackson, who remember it that way, who went to school in Jackson, remember it that way. And we're very fortunate to have this longevity and all of these great memories. And of course, the book only touches 1/100th of the stories that could have been told. And mostly what I spend my time answering is why didn't you put so-and-so in? Why didn't you tell that story about my dog that time, and I'm like, well, we only could do 40 stories and 40 paintings. Anything for Ginger, the real artist?
That's been a frequent question. Is that Maggie in the book? And I'm like, it is Maggie, yes.
Malcolm, can you tell us a little bit about publishing Diddy Why Diddy and what you wanted to do with that and what it wound up being?
Well, the Diddy Why Diddy was a monthly publication that I published for 6 years. I don't remember what year it started or what year it ended, but it was somewhere in that 80s time frame. But I saw that there was this void other than the Weekender at the Clarion Ledger, on Friday or Thursday or so, they would put a few things in there. I thought there needed to be some sort of publication that talked about art, culture, entertainment, music, this sort of stuff. So we started publishing the Diddy Why Diddy, Ain't No Town, Ain't No City. And Paul Canzaneri and I envisioned this enterprise, and lots of people contributed, lots of writers, lots of photographers, lots of poems. It was kind of an alternative. It was after kudzu, but before the Planet Weekly or the Jackson Free Press. But it was of that style. It was a monthly sort of freewheeling magazine publication that talked about entertainment and arts and culture. But it was named for the song that Willie Dixon wrote. Willie Dixon, the great Mississippi blues man from Vicksburg. There's a story in there about bringing him here for a homecoming that Chrissy was involved with in her project. But if I just keep telling you all this stuff, there'd be no reason to buy the book. So.
It's an excellent segue. Copies of the book are available for sale next door in the museum store. Ginger and Malcolm will be glad to sign copies of it for you. Help me thank Ginger Williams and Cook and Malcolm White. Hope we see you all next Wednesday.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right.